congratulations on being here. We'll start with a round of introductions from the panel. So my name is Anam, she, her pronouns, from Pakistan. Best of luck.
Hi, I'm Victoria. She has pronouns as well.
Andrew from New Zealand.
Okay, I know we have everybody's names written down, but it'd be nice if everyone could verbally introduce themselves, disclose any pronouns, if you wish to do so. Starting with side proposition.
Hi, I'm Manuela, she, her pronouns. I'll be speaking pop 1 and reply.
I'm Brendan. I'm second.
I'm Isabel, she, her pronouns, and I'll be speaking third.
Okay, opposition.
Adrian Kinendri, I'll speak first.
My name is Paul Mani, I'll do second and black.
My name is Barako Kumu. I'm speaking third.
All right, you all know the rules. I will still be tapping at first and seventh minute for ease of POI, so please do time yourself. And without any further ado, can you please have the first proposition speaker?
Team Kenya will tell you that it's possible to live a double life and give you reasons why it feels nice to have the best of both worlds. But they've already missed the crux of the issue, that women currently face hardships in the workplace because of the very reasons why gender inequality exists. In the status quo, no matter how much a woman promises not to pursue motherhood, people will still underestimate them, that children deserve full attention and partial isn't enough for a stable childhood. Maybe we don't make the current notions of society on motherhood disappear entirely, but crucially, we give women the pathway and pave them the pathway to pursue their careers entirely and better. Hallie had to propose, and I want to start with 3 points on setup. Firstly, establishing contracts about children. What happened when job applicants are interviewed and offered a job? This means 3 things. The first thing that this would mean is that explicit conversation about the implications of kids would emerge. And this implies that people are forced to address the elephant in the room, allowing them to make things clear and well thought out decision from the get-go. Secondly, there is clear and legally binding consequences for having kids, i.e., in the worst case, being fired. But thirdly, corporations that do allow employees to have children would make this more clear to attract more individuals in this subset and have more transparency than on our side. Second point on setup is that companies have the same incentives on both sides of the house to either hiring kids, individuals with kids, or without them. But firstly, they perceive that employees have a distracting force during their jobs, which doesn't allow them to work extra hours and commit more. And secondly, the likely case for these companies, for these contracting companies, would be for people to pay them if they go on maternity leave. Thirdly, our stance here is simple, panel. In the face of these incentives, we think it's best for companies to be transparent about what they're looking for, which allows kids to make a planned and informed choice. I want to move then to our first argument, which focuses on the most vulnerable stakeholders in this debate, then, which is on women. For the context is here, it is simple. When companies decide if they should have a woman, if they should hire a woman, they often take into account what they should hypothetically be a mother at some point. And when companies don't want workers who are parents, this means a couple things. Firstly, they make assumptions about the employees. This means that this isn't enough commitment that they need, and there isn't enough time to hire them for after hours. And this is often the reason why they sometimes miss important meetings, for example, to drop your kids off at school or to change their diapers. You care about this issue, panel, because all of this translates to women often being paid less compared to men, or men not being hired or them not being hired at all. Even when they explicitly say that they don't want kids, gender biases will lead employers to not believe them and think otherwise. Secondly, if you get hired but then get pregnant, they leave you off unexpectedly. Therefore, laying off women who had a stable salary for their family without the plan that they originally had is the burden that they have to deal on their side of the house. In the face of this, contracts are absolutely essential for 3 independent reasons. The first one is on credibility. When companies show a legal certainty that females can't have kids, this is one less factor they can use to justify not hiring them. So essentially, if they can't hire a woman, it's because of reasons of the skills that they don't have or the work experience that they can't pursue, and therefore they won't hire them instead of using that vague excuse. Secondly, on accountability then, women have more of a means to hold companies accountable. And this is true because now there's more transparency, i.e., when there's a pattern for a company to issue these types of contracts, there are paper trails to be called out for. And also, in the status quo, women try suing companies for wrongful termination, but they usually get away with this because it's hard to prove the correlation of them being fired and their pregnancy. And now they're expected to make contracts outlining their expectations for these kids. If a company hired somebody who initially wanted kids but then backs down, then women have a means to fight for what they deserve then. Third reason, for women who don't want children and wish to pursue a career, these contracts are finally a tangible justification for them to go through with this and a sacrifice to this for the people around them. To be clear, in the status quo, when you reach your late 20s, you often have different forces pressuring you to have kids. This applies for family, for example, when your aunt in family meetings telling you when you're going to have kids. This also applies to religion, amongst like the forces of having children is a blessing, or at a certain age you should start having kids because it's a gift of God. These forces are forcing you to have kids, and it's the reason why these people are pressured to have them in the first place and to prioritize them over the careers that they want to specialize in. And although this won't disappear, these contracts offer a counterbalance for these types of pressures that may take them away. In the office, then your co-workers are more likely to respect you as a woman, and these notions and biases are going to be lowered down. Comparatively, their side will be full of prejudice, guilt, and oppression. The impacts of this argument are simple then, and they're twofold. Firstly, we break the glass ceiling that women can't pursue their careers and having both things at the same time, and therefore expand the overtone window that women can't do both things at the same time. I'll take you after my first argument. And then secondly, we increase more autonomy for women because finally they can decide whether to pursue their own professional career, or they can also plan to have parenthood. But since this is a contract that is legally binding and the stakes are high, then that solidifies the commitment that they have to make because it is one they have to do in the long term. Sure, I'll take your point.
Is it legal to lay off workers after they have children in the status quo?
No, I think it is legal for companies who are putting this in a contract. Sure, it's legal. Second argument then that I want to dive into is the narratives around gender and parenthood. First thing I want to address is the changes in the long term for the perception of women and their abilities. Women, for example, that you find in boardroom meetings, women who are successful CEOs in the news. These individuals that see this internalize that women can achieve goals in male-dominated areas and industries. And currently, this is not the status quo because women are often locked out from these opportunities, and the collective perception that they can pursue these types of careers, and the women who are often found as CEOs in the news are often found rarely. Secondly, the delta here is simple. There is more exposure to powerful women, and therefore, as I said, the overtone window of women having to achieve these things are expanded. So therefore, this is more normalized, and you would see more women being CEOs and pursuing these careers. So therefore, the scientists that you see, the astronauts that you see, and the corporate leaders who you look up to are going to be better off. Secondly, there's more voice to push things in favor of women. There's this, for example, the development of period products, or more consideration of women in regulations in healthcare companies, for example. But thirdly, this changes the ideas around parenthood, and I want to be very clear about this. When companies make this a contract, they recognize the new level of commitment that it entails. This means that men who normally wouldn't be questioned about this would now become a topic of relevance in job interviews and careers. How do they internalize this then? Threefolded reason. Firstly, if they do want kids, they have to search for jobs that meet this metric. In the status quo, fathers often perceive having kids as something separate from their career, since this doesn't affect them hireability and them intrinsically compared to women. And therefore, this makes them more likely to recognize how much time and ability this entails. Secondly, if they are already a parent, then they get hired by companies that tolerate this. For example, in paternity leave, not having to work after hours. This is not having to work overtime. Then this division of the burden of not having kids becomes equal, at least in the terms of the corporate implications of it. And thirdly, and most importantly, is sacrifice. Because when you realize the women who stand before you in the workforce and in the office who don't want to have kids, this recognition is more likely to happen and more heavily weighed on our side. Because then the notion of society where pregnancy is a big deal and highly valued, once women put that off, that is seen as more of a valuable sacrifice that they have. Don't vote for the double life, where sides are often difficult for women. Vote for ours. Thank you.
Thank you, speaker, for that fine speech. Can you please have the first opposition speaker?
My name is Adrian Kinyanji. I'll take POIs at any point. Just shout to me and I'll tell you if I can take you. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, childbearing is a natural function of society. In propositions world, you take that away and you give that power and you give that function towards the control of companies and corporate executives. I think that's so bad on their side because it becomes so much worse, not only for minorities but just the entire society in general. A couple of things in response towards proposition. I think the first idea is in terms of the scope of this debate. We think panel, their world is like so unlikely to exist in the first place because they have their burden on this debate as per what they have told us now is they have to show us the likelihood that they're actually able to change narratives in society, change the narratives of things like parenthood in society. I think that's highly unlikely because we are going to explain to you why corporate incentive is likely going to overshadow this in its entirety. But the second thing they bring to us in this debate is about conversations of childhood and the likely outcome that they have on this. Because they say in our world, you don't have these conversations. Panel, that's just inherently intuitively false. There are conversations about them in society. They look like things of, you talk about the legal obligations that companies have towards people who have children, things like providing family fringe incentives and benefits, things like health insurance, so that conversations actually exist in society. The delta on this debate is that on our side, employees are free to have children in our world. On their side, you are heavily coerced and your world becomes entirely damaging. But even in terms of the impact of their world, they actually just can't materialize because a lot of it is hinged that companies are likely going to retaliate against people who have children in the first place. But we come and tell you even through our peer that that's something that's unlikely because in society and in status quo, it's illegal to do that because it's viewed as discriminatory. So the likely implications towards companies is that you're going to be heavily fined, you're going to be sued, so you're disincentivized from that in the first place. A couple of points in reframing this debate. One, why companies benefit from employees not having children in the first place. Notice primarily the idea here is that they are so profit oriented in a capitalistic society where competitive advantage is so critical to maximize profit. It looks like they're not wanting to offer paid leave. They want to have less maternity leave for women within their companies. You don't want to have to be able to offer things like health insurance or family fringe benefits. So they value this because of two things. One, they save on the cost of these benefits. But two, they can be able to then redirect this cost to enhancing productivity to improve that competitive advantage in their world. Notice panel's second point here. These companies are likely going to incentivize and heavily financially incentivize employees to sign these contracts and take upon themselves these these agreements. Two ideas here. One, you end up having the companies having a guarantee of low financial costs, which they can then redirect to things like bonuses, promotions, and just the financial reward and incentive for these contracts. But two, you ensure them having a long-term guarantee of a higher productivity because you have no people having distractions of children. So you don't have parents leaving to go pick up their sick child from school on their side. So paid leaves, which end up reducing the total profits of these companies, end up reducing on their side. The value of this is that that it proves that companies have a need for maximizing the productivity and incentivizing employees to sign such contracts for employment. But the biggest point of framing here is why then the opt-outs on their side are so much worse. Because it means then that companies will literally exploit this by further deterring childbearing from employees through things like in the contracts, complete total employment terminations if you go against these contracts. Notice what the delta is on our side. Now it's legal. On their side, it was illegal. Notice panel, things like, the logistical challenges of this also disincentivize people from further pursuing to terminate their contracts in the long run. Why? Because if employees then change their minds midway, they're going to view, the opt-outs, if not termination, not as a worthy trade-off. I think the value of this is that it proves to you that employees at the employment stage of their lives, when they sign this contract, are likely going to be locked in due to one, the high initial incentive, but two, the low opt-out mechanisms of their world. The comparative was to prove to us why not having children in the first place is likely going to be better in its entirety. The first argument then on our side is why this policy leads to large overarching harms towards the society. The idea here is that you end up having a reduced amount of children in society, and this is drastically a bad thing for just macroeconomic ideas. Notice a couple of layers here. One, who already exists within these employment periods. I think it looks like two things. A, there are the young individuals who are at the point of their 20s or their young 20s who are still deciding on their lives and pathways in lives, and they're likely incentivized to take this because they have personal motives to get money at a young age. Everyone wants to have a lot of money, so they're likely going to sign this contract. But two, notice how these individuals, or most individuals, stay in employment for most of their lives. Notice panel, in places like England, Kenya, Latin America, you spend most of your life in employment in order to make sure you have ends meet and to have an assurance of that pay. But even things like delay at our best case scenario, which we thought they were going to run in terms of a delay, means that individuals can only then now get children at the end of their careers or at that end of period of time, which is likely going to be so long anyways, so you're still going to be late. Notice the second layer here, that the harm is that you end up having less individuals entering the workforce, and even at best, you have to wait a longer time for individuals to enter if it's delayed on their side. A couple of things here. If you forgo contract, and if you have a foreclosed contract dominance, this is to say you have a delay, you entirely have less children entering the workforce. Why? Notice panel, individuals won't want to have children at old ages or delayed periods. One, they're not going to be able to handle children at ages like 60 or 70. But two, it's likely going to be too late. Even the narrative of having children at old ages is something that disincentivizes people from having children in the first place. But two, in terms of the delayed contracts, we think you increase the period of transition within the workforce, and the impacts of this are so large. The impacts here are threefold. One, the workforce is just generally weakened in its entirety. Notice individuals existing within notice the people who exist within the workforce, and people are going to have to come and replace those who go out of the workforce and who go out to retire. On that side, it's so minimal. So production in the macroeconomic level is going to decline on their side. But two, the current workforce is going to be overworked, and that's why a lot of their harm comes on their side. Because due to a deficit, the current individuals are going to have to compensate. So you end up having to have things like longer working hours for similar pay, which overexerts individuals. Before I move on to the third impact, I'll take your point.
Your children on your side may get cared for when they're sick, but don't get enough attention when they need because of the company demands you characterize. How do you solve this?
Panel, I think just inherently on our side of the world, people are able to choose if they want to going to prioritize their children or choose if they are going to prioritize the company. Even things just make so much logical sense. Individuals are able to weigh how they're going to engage with their children, how they're also going to balance their work-life force. On that side, you have to prove why people are likely going to then only care about their companies. We tell you on your side, that's the likely outcome. Notice the third impact here is that policy ends up getting worse. Notice that individuals who can't work anymore are still going to need things like pensions upon retirement and all those things. So the state is likely going to have to increase things like taxes to match the deficit gap left on their side, which have been filled by a larger work labor force on our side. Panel, this is factually to look at states like that happen in places like Europe, countries like UK and France that are already experiencing these effects because of the low amounts of labor force. The importance of here and how you weigh this is in terms of scale, because too many people in the economic sector end up suffering as a result of this. But in terms of time frame, the short and long-term impacts for employees become so much worse. Notice, panel, the second argument we bring to you here, which is going to be extended represented by by O2 is in terms of minorities. A couple of things you have to understand here. Marginalized groups are incentivized structurally to take this policy because they don't have any alternative, they don't have any choices because they need the money. So you have more, and the problem is that less privileged backgrounds are going to prioritize these incentives. Notice the second thing here, more privileged individuals don't have this disadvantage, so they can't actually have their choice on their side. The way this is so bad on their side because children notice are a source of happiness, and it's a function, and it's like a priority and a principle for everyone to be able to have these things. Notice the Wombat theory, how it's able to give people happiness. The importance of this is that it's principally unjustified to lock out an entire subset of individuals from experiencing this normal function of life and existence, especially when they need this release more than any other individuals, just for the sheer harm that exists because of their existence that we're proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the speakers for their very fine speech. I now invite the second speaker from proposition to continue the case for the process.
I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, talk about the vulnerable stakeholders, which are women in this debate, and why they get more access to jobs. But secondly, I'm going to talk about how there's going to be a change in terms of the perception of women in these corporate jobs. Having that said, I want to firstly do like a response to their whole argument. Their first argument is that, well, their first response to our argument is that companies are oftentimes profit-oriented, which means that there's going to be they're not going to be like these companies are going to incentivize these individuals to sign the contracts. I have four responses. Number one, if companies are so profit-oriented, why would these companies give advantages and benefits to women in the very first place for things such as maternity leave, right? I think we've told you from the start that insofar as these companies will have to pay some portion of maternity leave things, and insofar as that is true, it is unclear why these companies will do this in the very first place. But also, we've told you that if these companies are so profit-oriented, as they rightfully characterize, then that is precisely the reason why these companies hire less women in their side in the very first place. So there is a missing link in this argument. But second of all, we've told you that that is precisely the reason why there's less women in corporate fields and whatnot under their side. Because Manuela gave you a whole argument on things such as how companies are profit-oriented, which means that they have assumptions on things such as women might leave. They have assumptions on things such as they have to pay for maternity care and whatnot. So insofar as that is true, this means that companies are profit-oriented. That will mean that they will hire less women under their side of the house. But thirdly, we've told you that women can leave and come back to corporate jobs. It is unclear why women, these individuals, cannot change jobs, for instance. We've told you that in the status quo, the vast majority of individuals change jobs 3 or 4 times in their life. So in our side of the house, women can surely have one job, have a transition period where they have kids, and then move to another job. It's unclear why that doesn't exist in our side of the house. But fourthly, we told you that there's these companies will still give these individuals maternity leave because we told you that the job market is limited, which means that if some companies have these contracts, then the other companies have an incentive to give things such as maternity care and stuff like that, so that these individuals so that they can recruit better individuals. Because now there's a comparative benefit on these companies who give maternity care, which means that they can attract more stakeholders, which is the reason why, and Manuela told you that these companies still have an incentive in our side, a subset of companies to give maternity care and stuff like that. So I think we effectively mitigated their point. And if their issue was about how companies are profit-oriented, we flipped their claim because now there's going to be less companies, there's going to be less women in corporate fields under their side of the house. They then give us 2 arguments. The first is that there's going to be a reduced amount of jobs. I have two responses. First of all, I think this is untrue, right? People oftentimes change their jobs. It's unclear why in our side of the house people can move to another job, and during the transition period they can have children as well. But second of all, we told you that people can still have children in our side because things such as transition period, and it's not true. But also, they have a missing burden and missing link in this argument. Why is it a good thing for having more children in the very first place? I have 2 responses. Number one, we told you that this is a problem in the status quo because there's currently an overpopulation. It looks like how there's so much overpopulation in developing nations and stuff like that, where there's a lack of housing, where there's more suffering. So it's unclear why having more children is a good thing in the very first place. They have a burden that their second speaker has to prove this. But second of all, we told you that this is worse for these individuals, especially minorities, because under their side of the house, if these minorities have more children, then what happens is that they cannot care for these children in the very first place. Because like, insofar as these minorities have to care for other things such as their jobs, and when not under their side of the house, they put less attention to their children. If they're in a financially unstable situation after the children do not get the essential foods and education that they need. So overall, if there's going to be more children in their side of the house, then these children will be in more suffering. It is unclear why that was inherently a good thing. They have a burden to prove that, and if they don't, this argument drops. But second of all, let's talk about the term on minorities and how it's going to be worse. We've told you that there are the existing conditions that prevent minority from having children already in their side. It looks like, first of all, how they cannot afford food and education and essential stuff that is necessary for having kids. But second of all, we told you that they have a higher burden. These minorities have a higher burden, which prevents them from having kids in the very first place. So it's unclear why this contract is a tipping point that reverses all of this. It's unclear why it's going to be so far worse in terms of minority on our side. So I think we effectively mitigate those 2 points. Having that said, let's firstly talk about the vulnerable stakeholders on women, how they're going to have more access towards their jobs. We've told you that the problem in the status quo is not that these women the problem in the status quo is that there's a less portion of women in corporate jobs. I mean, Manola told you things such as how they get less wage than men, but also there's a less portion of women in corporate jobs. How do we change this? We use their metric and their mechanism that they rightfully give us, which is how companies are profit-oriented. Manola told you that there are things such as, one, not being able to hire, the companies having a disincentive to hire women because now they cannot require women to, they cannot require women who have children to stay late and stuff like that. But second of all, we told you that how, companies have a disincentive of hiring women because they try to maximize their efficiency and effectiveness of their employees. So it looks like how these companies will have to partially pay maternity leave, and it looks like how there's an unpredictability of whether suddenly a woman employee is going to leave because she has the children and whatnot. We've changed this in our side because now in our side of the house they guarantee that this woman will stay, which means that insofar as that's true, these companies now do not have a disincentive that exists in their side of the house of not hiring women. And so far as that's true, what it means in the round is that in our side of the house, now these companies have more incentives to hire women. And here's the thing. First of all, there's going to be more women voices in the corporate jobs. But second of all, we reduce the things such as lower wages and we also increase the general portion of women in these corporate jobs. But also, Manuela told you a really important point, which was unresponded, which is how there's now more accountability for these companies. And crucially, they say that it's illegal for companies to fire these women. But we've told you that that is not the case in the vast majority of instances, especially in developing nations, because these corporate companies have massive amount of profit, they have massive amount of money, which means that they can now use better lawyers and stuff like that to cover it up. So in our side of the house, accountability is comparatively better because now there's a transparency, because now there's a direct correlation between pregnancy and getting fired because there's a contract. So if this contract is violated, then these women can go there and then sue them, which is going to be far better. So overall, what happens is that in our side of the house, there's going to be a greater portion of women being hired, but also there's going to be better accountability of these companies. But second of all, I want to talk about how perception of women changes in these corporate jobs, which is largely unresponded under their side. And the implication around is twofold. We've told you two things here. One, that there's going to be more portion of women, and that's going to change the existing patriarchal and glass ceiling that exists. We've told you that insofar as there's more women and more women voices, that will mean that it's more easier for women when it looks like how there's more women in corporate jobs who create company policies and stuff like that. It means that how there's more women who can actively engage in these activities. I'll take the point.
How exactly are your narratives able to overcrowd or to overshadow the corporate?
Okay. So I'm going to illustrate how this looks. It looks like how in things such as STEM fields, now you have more women coworkers. Now as a man, initially you might have like this patriarchal idea that women should not be in here, but now you have, insofar as you're exposed to more women, this means that now you can see how they're as qualified as you are. You can see how you're more used to be working with women and stuff like that, which means that you get more exposure to women coworkers. But also we've told you that there's secondly more women voice in these corporate jobs. So initially under their side house, there's less portion of women, which means that there's an overruling narrative is from men, but in our side of the house, we counterbalance that with more women in these jobs. But second of all, we've told you that parenthood is a topic that gets more discussed, and also the important part here is that now men can also understand the commitment that is necessary for parenthood. And essentially, we've told you that from the start, in things such as job interviews and stuff like that, now men also have to engage in things on the consequences of having parenthood. So it looks like how when you're having the first job contract, then you have to consider on what it takes and the commitments that you have to make when you have a children. And so far as that's true, there's more discussion in things such as parenthood and things such as having women, and men can more relate to these things on women. Overall, we went firstly on how we get more women workers in corporate jobs, but second of all, we also break the glass ceiling and the general idea that exists. This is a clear ballot for Team Mexico.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. Can you please now have the second alternate date for the object here?
Okay. Okay. Begin my speech if the panel is ready. Yeah. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think Proposition's case is the most anti-feminist case that I've ever had, because this is what they tell you. Women cannot possibly have a job and also have kids. They either have to have a bad job or they cannot raise those kids well. Considering that feminists have been fighting for, the past, decade or so, or for very much longer than that, for the ability to be able to do both, we think it's unclear why Prop wants to cut off women from this, right? Because what do we then tell you, right? Our case is simple. One, children are a net good for society, and we ought to incentivize people to have the most amount of children, and we'll explain why, or just incentivize people to have children. We'll explain why that's a good thing. But even secondly, why their case only cuts off minority women from being able to have children, and why that is then a bad thing. First piece of direct response to Proposition as to why minorities are likely going to have children anyway, but then why it's worse off for them on side Proposition. First, 3 reasons as to why minority women generally tend to have children that directly responds to when Prop say they don't have money to have it. 3 things. First, notice how we just think that minority women tend to be the most conservative or buy most into religious doctrine and all that kind of stuff. And so they have been socialized, as P1 comes and says, into believing that having children is a good thing. And so they generally just tend to have the most amount of children. But also they are marginalized, and so they see children as an opportunity to raise them from salvation. That's why you see poor women having 10 kids, because if 2 kids become doctors, then they can probably come and save me. But even third, just notice how they are stressed panel, and stressed people tend to have sex a lot, and so they're likely to have a lot of children. And so we just think poor people do have children. That's something that is uncomparative. What then is different then is on their side, you reduce the incentives for the support structures for these children. Why? Because notice right now where people get support for children from corporates. Notice how on our side, or just legally in status quo, you're mandated to do things like give paid leave off, to give support for these women, to give them nursing rooms within their build your buildings and all that kind of stuff. Notice how all those incentives disappear on Proposition. Why? Because you actively employ people who are not going to have children, as they explain. And so there's no need for you to give things like maternity leave. There's no need for you to give things like a paid time off and all that kind of stuff. And so note what you do. You leave these women making a choice. Am I going to have children and gain access to all these benefits, or not have children and get my job? Notice how that's an unfair choice. It's a coerced choice. Prof needs to explain why that's the choice they want to have children to live. On to then why we just think we're better for society, or why the harms for society on Proposition are so big. I think Adrian already comes and proves to you that look, hey, companies have the incentives and ability to prioritize employers who have less kids. This looks like they spend less money on these people. They have a more committed workforce. All the things that Prop come and tell you. Note he also proves to you why people are likely to opt into continuing to have kids for to opt into staying into their job, because look like they are probably signed a contract. They are clouded by ambition when their kids. I'll explain the relevance of that. Notice then why we think they cannot opt out of the agreement. 3 reasons. First, they probably risk losing their job. For the vast majority of people, think about how unemployment is so bad bad right now, it's unlikely they're going to get another job, and so they're far more likely to postpone having kids for the most amount of time. But even secondly, they likely know that the fact that they have a kid increases their chances of being unemployed, because they recognize that employers are likely going to want to prioritize kids without, children. Notice why this is just something that is likely to happen. We think companies always pick and choose whom they want to hire. If there's no mandate to hire whom they want, we think they're actually more incentivized to not hire people with kids, because you have a whole other subset of women who are willing to sign off, not having kids. They're far stronger guarantee. Third, we just think there's literally a time frame, particularly for how, well you can have children, right? Just think about it biologically. The older you get, the worse the quality of your sperm and your eggs. But there's also this thing called menopause, and so women just can't have kids biologically after the ages of 45 and all that kind of stuff. And so we think the longer you postpone it, the less your chances of having kids. And so we think that all of that is to say that on proposition, they must defend a world in which the vast majority of women are not having, as many kids as they would be having on proposition. I also think it's just necessary for all of their impacts to materialize. Why do we think that's a bad thing? Three things. Notice my first speaker already tells you the harms economically. That's just to say you have a less, as you have a smaller workforce, you have a smaller existing workforce that increases the burden on so many people. It increases the burden on the people who are working, because now they have to, get tax laws to be able to fund the pensions for the older people or the social services. It looks like them having to retire less or longer. They have to retire when they're older. Why? Because there's less people coming into the workforce, and all those harms. I think he does a good job in explaining the economic harms. But why do you think it's bad politically? Because we think children generally, or the young people, tend to be agents of political change. We think they tend to be the least complacent with status quo. Think about how the vast majority of new generations tend to be far more radical. Why? Because they haven't spent as much time, they haven't bought into the system as much. So notice on opposition, when you have less kids, on proposition, when you have less kids within society, you generally have a less capacity to be able to fight the system, because there are less people who are going to vote for more radical parties, right? But even socially, we just think that kids are a source of joy to the vast majority of people. And I think this engages with the feminist argument you get from them, because we think insofar as being a child, being a woman, because children generally tend to be a source of joy for the vast majority of women. Think about how my parents at home are really happy because they birthed the first 10 Kenyan team to break. I've generally brought them a lot of joy. We think likely that you cut off women from accessing this joy. Why do we think that is true, right? Notice how we already explained to you why minorities are going to be coerced into not having kids. Notice why this is antithetical to the ideals of feminism. Because what feminists fought for is the ability to have a choice. It's the ability for you to be able to choose whether you want to have both a kid and have a life. Insofar as we are able to prove to you why you get that on our side far better, I think we win this debate. But before I prove that, I'll take your point.
Minorities will still have kids in both sides of the house, because in our side of the house, the minorities will still have incentives to have kids, because there's no existing maternity care or stuff like that in your side of the house as well, in industries where they work.
Okay, fine. Assume they both have kids. On your side, they just don't get employed. That's the difference. On our side, they get employed. They get the support systems. They get the structures. And it's unclear the strategic value of that POI, right? Onto then, just why we think giving women access to this satisfaction is a net good and something that the panel ought prioritize, right? Again, we already explained to you why the core ideals of feminism, generally, dictate that women have access to the choice, right? But notice then how P1 gives you, for multiple reasons, notice how P1 gives you huge amounts of analysis as to why women are generally socialized into believing they want to have kids. Things like religion, things like the fact that that's generally just what they've been brought up to do. This goes to show you then that women generally feel some form of satisfaction or some form of societal obligation to have a lot of kids. Notice on proposition, again, you force these women into a trade-off. Am I likely to want to have kids? You force them to then make the choice whether they want to have kids or not have kids. I'll explain then the impacts of that just in a bit before I now go on to weighing the two cases. Let me go on to weighing the two cases, right? Notice why proposition is just best for all proposition is best for all the vulnerable groups in this debate. First, we help the most amount of women have the most amount of kids. We just generally help the amount of women have kids. Why? Because of opposition, we give them the support networks through the corporate frameworks that I already explained. On opposition, you reduce the incentive. On proposition, you reduce the incentive to support these women. But even secondly, we help society have kids because, again, you incentivize or you reduce the incentives to not have kids. We've explained to you how that's far, far more beneficial in terms of the harms to society that characterizes. But even lastly, we just think we are more, in line with the core feminist values. We are more in line with what, the average intelligent voter would likely vote for. And panel, I think for all those reasons, never been prouder to oppose.
Great.
In a world where companies already have incentives to not hire individuals that have kids, I think that is precisely why it's so important that we make this a more transparent process through which individuals can identify patterns and actually call out the companies that are doing this repeatedly, through which individuals can get a paper trail that they can use in a trial when they are unfairly fired for getting pregnant, which does happen on their side of the house, because even if it is illegal, the truth is that people still get fired and they still don't get fair trials where they are actually able to hold the companies accountable for the injustices that they take. Ultimately, the side of opposition has no impacts when they are unable to prove and choice will happen under their side of the house. Three main issues in this speech. First, on choice. Secondly, on women. Third, on minorities. Four issues. And fourthly, on accountability. So, on choice. I think that both sides agree that some companies have incentives to avoid hiring individuals who don't want kids because they want productivity, because they want reduced pay leaves, because they have biases. And I think that this is something that opposition characterizes from first. However, opposition claims that companies will coerce those who they hire through money. First of all, we think that it is unlikely because it is a legal process through which they have to be signing contracts with a third party present in the room when the moment in which they're signing a contract for 5 years where they can't have children and things like these. So we think that it's unlikely that they're coerced under their side of the house when the process is more transparent rather than just a conversation between the employee and the hirer. But secondly, we think that it is still better because in the status quo, the reason why they're coerced is because they have the threat of not getting hired in the first place, because they have the threat of having a worse salary as a woman, because the moment in which people believe that you can get pregnant, they don't care about you having a good salary because they think that you will leave the company eventually. However, we think that here, if it is true, you still get paid more in the cases where you don't want to have where you get coerced, which is still unlikely, so it outweighs this. But secondly, I think that the response is mitigatory at best, because our claim about choice was first on credibility, about how in the status quo women are simply perceived to aiming to have kids because that is what they perceive to be the main goal of women around the world. These gender biases that would cause individuals to avoid hiring them in the first place. So even if they claim that they don't want to have children, the employers don't believe them and they are less likely to hire them in the first place. But secondly, I think that our claim was on accountability for companies, because even if conversations happen on opposition where they talk about these families where they talk about their medical insurance, I think that there's no paper trail. Because yes, in many countries it is illegal to lay off individuals from a corporation. However, they still are. And in a world where there is a biased court system, a lot of women can't actually prove that they were unfairly laid off because of a pregnancy, because it's really difficult to link the fact that they were laid off to these other issues, because companies can often justify it on other claims that the employees have no way to counteract. On the other side of the house, the moment in which there are clear contracts, when a company agrees to you having a child and claims that they will not fire you because of this, you have a contract that you can use in a courtroom the moment in which you get fired. I think that we get a lot more accountability on their side of the house for those individuals that are worse off on their side. But the bottom line of this is that we ultimately get more flexibility and we get more informed choice on opposition, because the moment in which you're able to actually choose between getting a job where they care about kids or where they don't is the moment in which you get more agency. I think that there might be a missing link for you, panel, which is to understand that there are still companies who hire people with kids on both sides of the house. I think that Manuela tells you from first that this is likely, because first, in the status quo, empirically, there are companies that hire individuals with children simply because after a certain age, it's very likely that you have kids, so the moment in which this happens, you still get hired. And secondly, because they still have, on their side of the house, they will have an incentive to bring in employees by having this as a benefit, because the moment in which there's more transparency in the issues of motherhood and parenthood in general, I think the companies can tell individuals who they're trying to hire, yes, come to our company because we actually give you maternity leave, we actually want you to have children. What does this mean for the round? That there's likely not a lot of change in the companies that already want individuals to have children, because on both sides of the house they will exist and they will likely have a choice to go there because they do have incentives to be able to get more employees and to offer this as a benefit, especially for those types of companies that can't offer super high salaries. So for instance, a restaurant might tell their employees that they can actually come to their company because even if they don't have super high salaries, they can have a maternity, which is a lot more likely under our side of the house. So ultimately, ultimately, I think that the change doesn't necessarily happen here, but it happens where the companies don't want children in the first place. And what we give you is actually choice, actually informed consent, so that you know what you're getting into from the get-go, so that you have accountability for the company if they fall back on what they had promised to firstly. I think that there's response to a lot of their seconds analysis on the harm for individuals who want kids, because the reality is that those who want kids will still be able to get them under our side of the house. Yes?
How then does a contract incentivize corporations to hire women uniquely, especially when you say and P2 says that individuals still have a large choice to have children on your side?
Thank you. We tell you that they are a lot more likely to hire women uniquely because there's more credibility, there's more accountability, and because they know that if they don't want women to have children, they will not have that when they're within their corporation. And on the other hand, like all the other corporations who don't necessarily care about children stay the same under their side of the house and under ours. But now, I think that ultimately we get a lot more choice under our side of the house when it is clear, and you can weigh this heavily because of the fact that it truly improves the lives of individuals who wouldn't have been able to access a job in the first place, particularly on minorities. Now, on women, I think that we give you a clear argument where we explain to you that they're already coerced choices because in the status quo, they're often pressured to have children even if it's not something that they actually want. What they say is that if women should be able to access the joy of kids and that they get more choice under their side of the house because since women are socialized into having kids, they will be able to have them. However, we think that this is precisely why it's so important to provide a counterbalance. Here, I want to ask you the question on what is the role of feminism. I think that the reason why they're able to provide a choice for women is because they counterbalance the rest of the narratives in the rest of the world. If in the status quo, women are often pushed towards having children, pushed to give up their career for the sake of being mothers, that is when feminism comes in to tell them, no, it's okay if you want to be a career woman, it's okay that you don't want to be a mother and that isn't your sole goal in life, and you provide a counterbalance where women who do want to have children are a lot more likely to feel good about their choice because they know that it's something that they chose actively, not something that they were pressured into, and where women who don't want to have children have more ways to justify to their families, to their friends, that they didn't want this, and that it's okay because that's what companies demand from you. So ultimately, we think that it's a lot more likely that we get this counterbalance under our side of the house, and that women are actually able to be better the moment in which they break the glass ceiling and there's more individuals in positions of power that can incentivize other individuals as like role models and make them see that it is possible to get to those positions, and the moment in which women are in the room when decisions are being made. I think that ultimately, if more women get hired, we actually get more women in boardrooms who are making decisions about like major policies or major changes within companies that can directly impact the lives of all women, regardless of whether or not they have a position in this job or not. But now, I want to engage on their point on female minorities. What happens when individuals can't really choose to switch jobs? I think that what happens is that, first of all, they have more accountability for these companies. Because the moment in which a lot of companies are pushing individuals to not be able to like get hired because of they have children, I think that it's easier for external actors like the media or like other companies to hold them accountable. When there's a specific company or like a certain industry that is not hiring individuals with kids, I think it's easier to call out these biases and actually have like proof that this is something that they're doing and that this is not okay. They can identify patterns and they can do this. But secondly, I think that they often don't have this option in the status quo, because in the reality is that they often have low paying salaries. They often have like all these other issues that don't necessarily let them make the choice of having children. I think that if they do have children, it will necessarily be what they aim to do. So ultimately, we think that female minorities or minorities in general who wouldn't be able to choose between jobs due to like low paying salaries or other issues are mostly symmetrical under their side of the house. So how do you weigh this? I think that in the case of minority women, you don't get a lot of change. However, in the case of all other women, it's a lot more likely that you get better under our side of the house. And moreover, we think that in the long term, the moment in which we start to shift the overtone window and normalize the idea that women can be in boardrooms, that they can be CEOs, it is a lot more likely that this trickles down to minority women as well. Because when you change the perception of what genders can do, you change the lives of every individual in this subset. So ultimately, we think that we get a lot more impacts on minorities. But thirdly, I want to talk about our argument on parenthood that was simply dropped by their second op. We believe that we tell you that first of all, we change the ideas around parenthood overall because we're actually recognizing the commitment that parenthood entails in a paper trail. This means that men have to take this into account the moment in which they choose a job. This means that individuals actually have to recognize the fact that there is a double burden. So no, our case is not anti-feminist. It is precisely the opposite. Because yes, women should be able to do both things, but in the status quo, they can't really because they are overly burdened with motherhood. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. I now invite the opposition with the speaker to close off this productive part of debate. Thank you.
I start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, when we tell you that a vast majority of very many Kenyan women have the active choice on their side of the house to choose between whether or not they're either going to get career mobility or children, we tell you on our side of the house, we expand this choice at the point where we do not have them being legally obligated to declare that before they get any sort of employment. Firstly then, on clarification. One, notice as to how these contracts are likely to work. Because at the point where we tell you, you're probably going to incentivize these people as a company with money to be able to forego their ability to have children at the point where they're working for you, then they cannot come and say that you have this opt-out. Secondly, about this opt-out, because they're trying to come and tell you that it is something very easy. But note, panel, for something that we think is a natural process of life, you do not need to have these logistical issues logistical issues of having to terminate a contract to be able to opt out. We think it's principally unjustified. Then on to strategic call-out, panel, because let's notice something about their case. It is inherently contradictory when they tell us that choice is something that they win on because they can have children, but then in the same breath say that corporations will hire more women with this contract that still cuts the existence of this free choice. This contract essentially is to limit this choice, not to expand it. What I'll do then in my speech is show you as to how on our side of the house we're able to expand it further for these women. Firstly then, on this whole idea about choice and so on and so forth, what do we tell you, panel? We tell you on proposition, firstly, that it's very likely that these people will take it. Notice as to how companies on their side have both sides have these profit incentives. That is to say that, and these people essentially are also being exploited at a very vulnerable stage in their life. It's likely then to also affect much younger employees, but also women specifically. That is to say that we tell you that they need money. They're trying to start life. Secondly, they're also trying to impress so as to get things like awards, recognition, promotions, and so on and so forth, things like upward career mobility, right? But thirdly, then note as to how these people tend to be ambitious, right? They want to compete. Firstly, on the social level, amongst friends, amongst family, amongst social media, things like LinkedIn, for example, exist for such things, right? But then secondly, within this job market, right, they want to get jobs, they want to join fellowships, they want to get into exclusive clubs in society. What is the strategic importance of this response? Is to show you that there are more incentives and push factors that are going to push people towards taking this contract, right? So on their side of the house, they cannot just come and say that they have a choice and opt-in and opt-out exist. So essentially, they can. When we weigh this on probability, we tell you then that it's highly, highly likely. But then next panel, why then do we think that even if people don't sign this contract, even in their best case, right, where they do not uptake this choice, why is it just principally wrong for companies to offer and allow employees to take these contracts? Twofold. We tell you one, there are many ways in which these employees' freedoms are already limited. That is to say that how you use your time, how the type of, the place you work and so on and so forth are limited, the type of salary that they pay you. But then secondly, panel, that employees already give up so much for comparatively less meaningful returns. That is to say that they give up things like their childhood and their early youth, going to school to get a diploma, to get a university degree, right? And at that stage, they're likely then to also forego things like their social lives and so on and so forth. The impact then on our side of the house when we don't have this. One, we tell you on our side we're able to expand the choice of these individuals, right? At the points where we've proven to you that there's limited autonomy for these employees in general, right? We uphold things like personal choice. This is something that we value. But then secondly, that before I move on to the whole idea about minorities, I'll take your point.
On your side, how do minorities choose whether or not they want to take one job over the other? I think the choice is already limited on your side for these individuals that are as vulnerable as you characterize.
Okay, fine. We don't necessarily have to fix that, but I'll tell you, but what we have to do essentially is not make it worse like you do on their side of the house. On to the whole clash about minorities. One, which side essentially uplifts these women more? What are the few pushes that we get from side proposition? They tell us, one, on their side of the house, they're able to bring some sort of accountability and transparency at the point where you make these women sign these contracts, you get a paper trail, and that is what they basically push on their side. One panel, just note that this is strategically flawed, owing to the fact that this is not even in the scope of the debate. That is to say that this is extremely uncomparative because there exist things like anti-discrimination laws. You are legally not allowed to discriminate against a certain group of women, right? Secondly, when you have things like maternity leave and so on and so forth, these are things that are secured in employee laws. That is to say that these are mandatory obligations for you to even operate as a company. So when they come and tell us as to things, as to how you get accountability and you'll be able to sue, panel, we don't understand. It already happens in the status quo. They don't give us any sort of solvency on that. You cannot credit that. It's just wasted time on their side of the house. Secondly, then, on the whole idea about narrative change, what do they come and tell us? One, they come and tell us as to how this contract essentially is going to reaffirm the choice of women because they're getting pressures from their families to have kids and they're trying to shift the overtone window. One panel, they do not do enough to prove this. They don't give us sufficient analysis as to how it's even going to materialize on their side of the house. But panel, not what we tell you strategically, especially when it is counterintuitive, right? At the point where you're trying to change this narrative, you're likely then to harm these minorities you so want to protect. What does the harm essentially look? Why then are we better to be able to change this narrative? Note then, on our side of the house, on their side of the house, motherhood is negatively looked upon. At the point where you're actively trying to deter it using a contract, it puts the notion into people's heads that there's something wrong about it, right? Then secondly, panel, that then means you're feeding into already pre-existing bias. What does that then do? It then means that the type of choices and the type of policies that are put in the workplace for women are essentially anti-women, right? Simply because you continue then locking them out. That is to say that on our side of the house, when we leave this choice, one, we're much, much better because there's more room to be able to correct that bias that already exists. But then we also think then that this choice is expanded at the point where we're much better because we'll be able to develop things like infrastructure for women to be able to make the workplace a place for women to be able to thrive so that these CEOs are actually able to get into this room. They need nursing stations to be able to take care for their children a few hours. We actually normalize this, right? And this normalization that we're able to get is the narrative change that materializes on our side of the house when the choice essentially is there. On your side of the house, when you put legal terms and cover all this on your side of the house, then it becomes much dangerous. Women are not able to thrive in the workspace. You push them and compel them to continue fighting. And as a matter of fact, you add another layer of legal barrier. You do not provide any solvency on their side, on your side of the house. But then lastly then, we tell you about minorities, right? On your side of the house, you tell us how they'll have low paying salaries and so on and so forth. But panel, I just want to give you an illustration and this will be able to solve it. Notice at the point of entrance when you're starting your career, you have two types of women. One who is rich, white, and privileged, and one who is black. On their side of the house, we think this one woman is likely then to make the choice to sign this contract because this means less risk for her, and she probably has the ability to be able to invest in things like IVF. On our side of the house, we tell you the black woman needs this money to be able to survive. She's coerced by the poverty that surrounds her. Never been prouder to oppose this motion.
And then please copies to close off our bench and let them invite the opposition to reply.
speech in 3, 2, 1. Motherhood is not a burden, like P3 says at the end of her speech. It is a choice. It is a choice that we think all women should be able to make. It is a choice that opposition strip away from women, give them a check and tell them, good, go be a good girl boss, yay feminism. I think proposition cannot win this debate because they literally make everything worse for women. They don't give women any form of choice. There's no accountability in their side of the house. But more largely, they're just bad for society in general. Never been prouder to win from opposition. First, I just want to point out, I want to engage and just clean the whole issue of women, right? Because they say, look, cool, we get more women in boardrooms because now there's more incentive to employ women because these women aren't having children. And so that's a good example for other women and shows you that, look, you guys can do this. 3 issues with this. First, notice the kinds of women that they have in boardrooms. Those are only women who don't have children. That literally tells young girls that, look, if you want to have a corporate job, if you want to do good in the workplace, if you want to have any semblance of success, you cannot have children. Because all the examples that they see as per Prop's own characterization are women without children. Notice how this, again, is just antithetical to all the ideas of feminism. It's unclear why they would push that burden onto themselves, right? Secondly then, notice we also tell you affect women negatively in the ways you perceive motherhood. Why? As my third speaker comes and it tells you, it's you perceive motherhood as a bad thing, something you have to choose, only insofar as, you have the money for it, something that is perceived as a luxury for the rich. But it's more so, it's something you have to sign off in a contract. Notice the other things you sign off when you get employed. You agree, I'm not going to do drugs, I'm not going to come to work drunk, I'm not going to, do all these bad things, and I'm not going to have kids. You equate motherhood with a negative thing. It's unclear why that happens on side, why we would like to have that. But even thirdly, note what we tell you, you reduce the support for these women because there's less incentive for corporate offices to do things like give maternity leave, to provide nursing stations, to give you paid time off, to give you, maternity benefits. Note on proposition, when there's no such thing as being able to sign off not having kids, corporations are forced to do this. Fourth, just like on strategic, engagement with proposition, I think it's unclear on Prop whether or not women can have children or not have children on their side. I think they debate it very messily because in P1 you're told, look, right now women can't have kids and can't do jobs, right? It's so bad we have to remove it. But then P3 comes and says, no, we have a couple of corporations in status quo that incentivize women to have kids. That's why they're still going to have kids on their side. We think they needed to make this like very clear. And so we just think like, the almost charitable interpretation of their case is just that, the vast majority of corporations are going to incentivize women to not have children because that's what, the analysis they give you. And so we think on their side they need to engage with why it's bad to not have children, right? Or why it's bad to, to have children. I think at the end of this clash then, it's very clear that side opposition is better for all sorts of women, particularly, and lastly, most important, the vulnerable women, whom we, tell you that are able to make this choice better on opposition, because on prop, they're always going to have to choose between money or children. They're always going to have to choose money just because of how society works, right? So we're better for women. Secondly, on choice, and I think this one is just really short because notice how there's just no choice that exists on proposition. It's a coerced choice. We've explained that ad nauseum. They choose not to respond to that. We think choice is incredibly clearly and proposition win, an opposition win. But just before I finalize the last clash, I just need to engage with their last point on like accountability, because they tell you that look, this corporation is going to be held more accountable by our contracts, especially when they fire women for having children. I think that just isn't true because if anything, accountability is better on proposition. Because as we tell you, it is only on proposition where if you get fired for being pregnant, you can go and sue the company for unlawful termination. It's only on opposition where these companies are legally mandated to provide you with maternity services because they chose to employ a woman. Women are meant to it's okay if women can have kids. It's something we ought to support. We think on proposition, if you get pregnant, you get fired. It's because you literally signed that agreement. It's unclear how they're any more accountable for these women, right? We think they can't. That's literally the stance they defend. They cannot change it in P reply, right? And so at the end of the day, panel, even if you don't buy anything else we say, we are best just for all the society analysis we give you. Never been prouder to win from all.
Speaker, to close off the debate, can we have the proposition reply?
first ballot for Teen Mexico as a pathway to the win is where women are better off. Let me be clear on what the comparative is. The woman with children on Team Kenya's side looks like the woman who at 8 a.m. are driving their kids to school, but at 9 a.m. is working at her office cubicle. It is, after she puts her baby to bed, she hires a babysitter because she works in after hours in the boardroom. It is the most vulnerable subset of the females in this debate feeling burnt out and stressed from too much work on their side, where they had to give you reasons on why this is good to take place. And notice how much this went unresponded. Let's point out the analysis on their second speaker gives you on why this is good to have children. We agree with them. It feels nice to be a mother, and all the lines that they give you on this notice conceded how it's fulfilling to spend and dedicate all your time to your child. But they also concede that it entails a lot of time for this to happen, and this is where they unfortunately can't win on this. If their point on having their better power choice is true, this is bad and detrimental. This adds to the lives and adds stress to their lives and leaves them burnt out at the end of the process. They push throughout the bench that companies are demanding, and yes, it is true, and it's because of that high demand of working and commitment that mothers are more harmed on their side. I'll flip their choice feminism choice after, but assuming that this is true, I urge you to value the practical harms of stress and not dedicating enough time over this one-liner feminist point they give you that they leave just floating around. We therefore outweighed their entire book analysis on choice and empowerment and took away the pathway where women are far better off, as Isa also told you in her P3. Their non-principle on choice feminism is not giving them the benefits that they wish for you to credit them, because notice, if you wanted to prove this to be true, they had a prerequisite to also tell you that women can't choose anything in the first place. Look, choice feminism came from the era in history where women couldn't even think about careers in the first place because they only could choose to be because the only way they could choose to be a relevant citizen instead of being marginalized as an enigma in society was actually having children and pursuing to be like a traditional wife. But back then this was a question of survival. But don't let them get away with saying that for a prop is the end of the world if you sign into a long-term plan. This was never a deal with the devil. This is women finally being credited for the sacrifice of motherhood that you weigh. I want to do an even if then. Even if they were relevant, you ought to weigh hours more for two specific reasons. The first is because they have more you have more focus and time for your own commitment. We already told you the forces in society that coerce them to have more children and are therefore underestimated. And this is why you see women being underpaid in the workplace. This is the reason why discrimination happens. They tell you this is illegal and this is wrong, and that is true. But because of that, and that's being undermined and normalized, is the reason why you see women currently being underpaid. And it's because of these contracts that is the only final legal footprint for them to actually justify this and suing other companies. Therefore, we give more justice to women. You cannot credit it on that and on their side. But secondly, they have more choice on this, and I want to get into that then. The second thing I want to point out is the second question I want to answer then is, can individuals choose if they can get a job where kids are allowed or not? Two subsets on our side then. Firstly, it's those who can. They get more clarity on what they can expect from the company. And on their side, women are scared to have kids because they don't know how employees will react. Therefore, if you get pregnant, you're slowly phased out of this, and you have the social consequences of this, like men overperforming you and underestimating you. That means that you get to hold the government accountable for these repercussions and for the legal consequences of this. With this one entirely uncontested on their side, and the only response is to the second subset of this group, which is individuals who can leave the company. They're coerced into prioritizing scarcity over goals of motherhood. And how is this weighed out? Firstly, we told you about certainty over change. In the status quo, marginalized individuals often don't get child support from their employees, and this is unlikely to get worse because bargaining power already doesn't exist on their side of the house. And on the long term, yes, in the status quo, some vulnerable marginalized women will be unable to choose. And yet we tell you that having these individuals in positions of power and with stable salaries is an inherent good. Because one, we shift biases because Black women working in STEM challenges prejudice, and the economic stability is prerequisite to empowerment. See you in Octofinals. Thank you.
Thank everyone for the fantastic match. Please cross the floor, shake hands, and wait outside. We'll call you back in for an OA in about 25 minutes.